Afternoon. I'm Stephen Bader, Executive Director of the East Bay Economic Development Alliance, or East Bay EDA. As a regional economic development organization, East Bay EDA strives to bring timely and relevant information to our members, partners, and other stakeholders so that we can all be better informed about key issues affecting the economic vitality and quality of life in our region. We're very excited that so many of you have joined us today for this webinar on the importance of industrial lands to the region. A few years ago, East Bay EDA launched the Resilient East Bay initiative to help connect businesses with critical resources and information, as well as inform policymakers and other stakeholders about the needs and opportunities to strengthen the East Bay's manufacturing ecosystem. That work continues as East Bay EDA coordinates technical assistance resources from the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, or MTC, around how to ensure that remaining East Bay industrial lands, called priority production areas, can be preserved for their best and highest value use. We have a fantastic panel of business and economic development experts today, but before they start, I just wanted to share that the panel may try and address audience questions as time permits. So we ask that those of you who have questions to put those in the Q&A and not the chat for our moderator and panelists to review. But without further ado, let me turn it over to our panel and specifically to our moderator for today's discussion, Mr. Ed Del Beccaro, Executive Vice President at TRI Commercial and Vice Chair of East Bay EDA. Take it away, Ed.
Thank you, Stephen. So we have a series of questions for our panel. So I'm going to ask first each panelist to introduce themselves with 1 or 2 sentences as to what they do, and then we'll go to a series of questions. Start with you, Donovan.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Donovan Lazaro, and I have the pleasure of serving as Economic Development Director for the city of Fremont. I also have the same hairstyle as John.
John, you're next.
Hi, I'm John McManus. I'm with Cushman and Wakefield. I'm an industrial broker working with landlords and tenants in Alameda and Contra Costa counties.
Janet.
Janet Galvez, Capital Deployment with Prologis. I have the pleasure of working with everyone on this phone call, John, Paul, Donovan, on several exciting projects throughout the Bay Area. Happy to be here.
Paul.
Thanks, Ed. Paul Nguyen, Chief Economic Development Officer with the City of Hayward.
Okay, thank you, panelists. I'm going to be then asking a series of questions of several of you. Feel free to, if there's something provocative or something interesting that you would like to interject, feel free to say, hey, Donovan, or just raise your hand, and then so we can have an interaction, a discussion as opposed to just questions. So, and again, audience reminder, if you do have questions, put them in at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a button for Q&A, put it in there, and we'll try to monitor those questions. So the first question, by the way, the industrial market in general is tight. John, why don't you just, unexpected question, what's the current vacancy up and down the South 880 corridor?
We just looked at the first quarter numbers yesterday, and I'm expecting, Ed, that they're going to come in at about 7.3% overall, but warehousing is going to touch close to 10%, with manufacturing lower than that. We do think that this is probably the trough. We're delivering a number of buildings. We don't count buildings as available until they have PG&E. We're going to deliver almost every under construction building this quarter. And so it should be the high water mark in vacancy given the activity that we're seeing out there right now.
By the way, as tough as that market might be, the office market is completely worse. So industrial is the favored market. So here's the first question, and this is going to be to Paul and then to Donovan. How do industrial buildings, manufacturing buildings, warehousing contribute to your local economies for job creation?
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, absolutely. Industrial buildings, particularly in former agricultural and then later blue-collar industrial communities as Hayward, are the backbone or the foundation of our local economies. These spaces provide a wealth of job opportunities for our community and have slowly evolved, and we'll get into this later in the discussion, but have slowly evolved to become a big part of why at least the Hayward general fund budget has been so resilient through tumultuous financial times.
Very good. Donovan, same question.
Fremont is a manufacturing town. You know, we have been for a very long time, you know, going back to the NUMMI days. And today, you know, we're very proud to be the #1 city in California for manufacturing, both in terms of number of companies. We have about 900 companies that make physical products here. almost entirely tied to technology, and collectively employing upwards of about 70,000 production workers. So, we've been making America great and manufacturing great again for a long time, and very proud of that role that we play. And just to kind of give you a sense of the magnitude, we get upwards of close to half of our general fund revenue from industrial and advanced manufacturing. So it is truly like the lifeblood of our economy, and we work tirelessly to kind of keep it humming.
Very good. Okay, so now we're going to go into real estate and development. So Janet, you'll be the first one, then John. So what is the role of industrial buildings and between what you do in urban and suburban communities, and what trends do you see shaping industrial real estate development? So Janet first.
Yeah, obviously, as an employee of Prologis, industrial is at the center of everything we do. We're the largest global industrial landlord, operator, and developer. In terms of what industrial does for us in the Inner Bay Area, we have a vast majority of tenants. It really ranges, right? Like Donovan said, we own a big our portfolio in Fremont consists of everything that Donovan just mentioned. It helps the industrial ecosystem. So it could be anywhere from advanced manufacturing to a warehouse, by RK Logistics or similar, that supports the overall ecosystem for our product and for our industry, really. Likewise, over in Hayward, we own a significant portfolio in Hayward. I want to say our largest portfolios are San Leandro, Hayward, Fremont, and we tend to see a mixture in Hayward as well. However, the closer you get to the port, the more warehouse uses that you see within those cities, right? In San Leandro and Hayward. However, given that we have a minimal amount of space in the Bay Area, right? We have water on one side, mountains on the other side. We're quickly seeing that tenants are running out of space, as close as possible to Silicon Valley. So then we start to see the migration up to Hayward and San Leandro, but it quite hasn't made its way there, right? Sometimes if Fremont doesn't have enough space, we might get a tenant to tour Hayward and San Leandro. And we always try, right? As a landlord throughout the Bay Area, we just try to fill our vacancies. We don't decide where those tenants go. The tenants decide where they go. So I'll stop there.
And I've coined a term for this, Ed. I call it industrial gentrification.
Yeah.
And so I know in city parlance, the G word is definitely not something that people like to hear. But when it comes to our industrial base, it's a great phenomenon. And what we've seen just over the last 10 years, and a lot of it has to do with great work that, cities like Hayward, and I'll give, our team here in Fremont credit for as well, is just bringing in a lot of world-class companies. And as they're fighting for space, the more commodity users that are not quite as location sensitive or can't afford the higher growing rents, they get squeezed and they're moving north and they're moving east. And ultimately that's good for everyone because it's bringing higher quality companies, usually technology related advanced manufacturing companies, up the 880 corridor. It's driving rents, it's driving property values, it's driving reinvestment and redevelopment. So when it comes to industrial, I think gentrification is something we can all be very happy to see. And this is an area where the East Bay really just dominates in the Bay Area.
So John, why don't we talk about that? There's two things there that Donovan mentioned. One is how the tenant profile has changed. The original tenants are migrating east. And then if you're in an urban zone like Fremont and Hayward and San Leandro, how do you get industrial buildings? Are they going up?
Well, yeah, and I think what Donovan's alluding to, I mean, I started a long time ago in the early 90s, and we would go to San Francisco and South San Francisco to prospect because everybody was moving east, and they came to Hayward and they came to Fremont, and now they continue east. That if you're a commodity warehouser and you are delivering things in 24 hours or longer to people, and that's the expectation, you probably can't afford or don't want to put up with the cost of being in the close-in East Bay. So the evolution has been to higher value product, product that needs to be just in time. And that's caused the buildings to change. Nobody's designing buildings these days that don't have a lot of room for maneuverability to move trucks and vehicles in and out quickly, that a lot of power and higher clear height. Ed, in answer to your question, you've got to go vertical because of the land cost. With the price per square foot of land that sits underneath you, it's translating into a much higher rent. You can't afford to stack 8 feet. You've got to go up 30, 36 feet to make it work. So the level of sophistication just overall, over the last couple of decades is really remarkable, both in the way the buildings get used and in the way the buildings are designed and constructed.
Very good. Now back to you, Janet. What factors do you consider in selecting a location to build or to buy an industrial building?
Yeah, we focus on tier 1 markets. So a lot of our portfolio is concentrated in the Bay Area, primarily between Richmond all the way down to San Jose. And we do have a small portfolio in Brisbane, but we're really after what we call tier 1 markets. So we rarely go south of San Jose and we rarely go north of Richmond. That doesn't mean we won't explore those areas, but given that we know, we tend to cluster around existing portfolios. And that's really because when there is a downturn, and we might be seeing one right now, as John mentioned, with vacancy creeping up, we see kind of those downturns hitting markets that are not tier 1 markets, because everyone wants to be closer to the population, right? San Jose being a major population, and also San Francisco being a major population. So that's a majority of where I focus on, and Prologis focuses on, is that what we really call infill Bay Area. And also because of land constraints, we know that it's not going to ever be an oversupply issue, right? We don't have unlimited land. So we're really just trying to minimize our risk, knowing that there's that the supply risk isn't going to be high if we go outside of what we're comfortable with. So that's primarily what we focus on.
So a question back to you, Paul. How do you balance community concerns with economic development? The dangerous things that industrial buildings do.
Sure. Yeah, it's been like I kind of said in the introduction. It's been a ride over the last 10 years, and John, you can attest to this. The transformation of industrial from your prototypical, old school blue collar, heavy industrial, dirty use type of buildings, and it's been an effort by city staff, my team, Donovan's team, and other cities around the Bay, including East Bay ADA, and what MTC is trying to do is trying to recharacterize and educate policymakers and politicians and residents about the value of these industrial buildings. And over the last 5-7 years, you've seen cities like Fremont and Hayward start adopting new industrial district regulations that kind of speak to this transformation, to provide cities with a level of comfort and understanding how they're protecting the harmony of uses between this interaction between industrial lands and residential lands, and kind of framing of what uses are allowed, what are the designs, and how these look and operate and feel. So, there's a certain underpinning that the industrial real estate portfolio is very highly valued. It's a matter of balancing and helping the community understand that these buildings, which often, are blank, giant, 150,000 plus 40-foot clear buildings with a lot of dock doors, aren't, the big, bad, worst thing in the world. And that the people need to understand that these are buildings that have very flexible uses that are, that are housing the businesses of tomorrow, the people who are making things and innovating and creating things that the world has not yet seen. But at face value, they're just giant boxes that are flexible and can be used by anybody. So it's a matter of just educating people that there are risks, there are negative impacts, traffic, noise, sound, smells, things like that are certainly understandable risks or negative impacts to the community, but helping the politicians and the stakeholders understand that, regulations and processes are there to balance that.
So Donovan, a variation of that question, then I'll go to John, is of those 70,000 jobs, how many come from the South 880 corridor, and how do you balance community concerns in your city?
Yeah, I think, are you talking about like where the residents of those jobs are originating? we're very centrally located, right, at Fremont within like a Bay Area context, and so one of the things that makes Fremont attractive to manufacturing companies is they can pull from a really, kind of far labor market radius, and they have to, right? Because a job that pays $30 an hour is $35 an hour, $40 an hour. It's a good job, but it's not necessarily going to. We're not going to fill all of those production roles with people that live in Fremont, right, or even in the kind of greater uh, Tri-City area. But I want to go back to your question here around like balancing community concerns. So a few thoughts. One is it's really helpful to have strong buffers with your industrial lands and other sensitive receptors. I know for some cities, just your inherited built environment doesn't allow for that. And Fremont, we're very fortunate. We are very deliberate in the city's development post World War II as it built out. We very consistently said no residential west of 880. And so we have these like really natural, very pure, if you will, like industrial districts that, we don't have the schools and the parks and really any other kinds of uses that can cause, kind of adjacent challenges. That really helps. And then, I think to Paul's point, he really kind of hit the nail on the head with respect to getting stakeholder buy-in. And that is a constant, never-ending task that we are just always doing because every 2 years you have new elected officials. And so we have to do an education and re-education process every time we have new stakeholders. And it's always a fun challenge getting your local elected officials to fall in love with industrial and champion manufacturing. And you do that by getting them into the buildings and seeing the activity. And, we can't shy away from the critiques of some of the, in my opinion, failed progressive policies that we've had in the Bay Area. Where we've seen really a hollowing out of the middle class and the middle income jobs and this bifurcation of the labor market where you have really high paid knowledge sector workers and then very low paid, service economy workers in dead end jobs with no upward mobility. And really manufacturing and industrial lands provide a way out. These are the middle income jobs that we all want to keep our region vibrant and balanced and healthy. And, we really champion that with our electeds to make sure that they understand, like, if this is, if you want to create pathways for people who maybe don't speak English as English as a second language or, recent immigrants or people that don't necessarily have, college level educational attainment, but provide ways for people to have a living wage and be able to not only survive, but thrive in this region. You really should be championing industrial. And fortunately, we've had a lot of success with getting that message out with our stakeholders.
Very good.
I
John,
kind of, sorry, I want to
ahead.
add to that because I think that's super important topic you just hit on, Donovan, and maybe it's real time because I'm going through very active planning commissions and approvals for projects, right? We're seeing a lot of pushback on these job creating facilities, particularly as it relates to labor, right? And to Donovan's topic, when I get asked about labor, I always say I'm pro any type of labor, particularly as Donovan mentioned. I mean, I grew up with parents that worked in warehouses. That's how I was able to go through college and how I'm sitting, at Prologis now building these industrial buildings. I never felt like I was missing anything. Food at the table, I was able to go to school. Like it was a means for my family to kind of provide for me and my siblings. And I grew up with 4 siblings. So when anyone tries to like limit the ability of like employment for all, not all of us get to sit in a nice cushioned office per se. So I think that's really important, Don, and I appreciate you sharing that.
Excellent point. John, you had a comment.
Well, I just think, Paul's answer and this question really get to the key tension and development in the Bay Area today. The majority of these buildings do turn out to be manufacturing buildings, and we're creating a building stock with new development for the next 50 years at least. And there is so much pushback against warehouse that I think sometimes it's keeping us from developing these more generic buildings that can be anything. There was a little bit of a run there where developers were willing to accept, hey, I'll take limits on advanced manufacturing, or even more onerous, a conditional use permit, based on users as you go. And as the climate has gotten more difficult, it's going to be hard to find capital to come in and support those projects. And so that education is going to become more and more critical, that people understand. And I think there have been a few projects that Janet's been involved in. And Janet, you were with the previous company, you entitled a project with Paul and Hayward that was a pure couple 100,000 square foot warehouse building, which ended up with an autonomous vehicle manufacturer inside it. But had the approvals not been there to allow it to be pure warehouse, to get the capital comfortable that they could be flexible, that manufacturer would never be there. And it might still be, I think at the time it was a parking lot. So the education is critical. And I think somehow we have to find a way to do it, not just at the moment that we're going to planning commission or city council, but hopefully to encourage people to come to forums like these and things that NAIOP and other organizations do, to understand that you may get a warehouse for the next 7 years, but 43 years of life left on that building. When it becomes vacant, it's built with enough parking, with enough power, you're going to see these jobs and things are going to develop. And that's really, there's so much tension around that at every public meeting. And we've really got to continue to tell stories like Janet did, and some of the statistics that Donovan shared last week when we got together.
Yeah. And that's also a great point. I think despite us being a company that doesn't need leverage, when I say leverage is a construction loan, many of our competitors do need construction loans. We still require zonings to say warehouse is allowed. If the word warehouse does not appear in the description, I'm going to have an uphill battle as well as any of my competitors, particularly those looking for financing. And that's even with us understanding that this industrial building can turn into a manufacturing building, like Donovan just alluded to, right? We still need that flexibility because, as we mentioned, there's economical cycles. As much as we all want the next manufacturer, and we all know they're going to pay a higher rent and they're going to build out this facility so that they're going to be sticky, I can't guarantee that. And therefore, we have to be able to provide the most flexible box possible. And given that we're in the Bay Area and the rents we're seeing and the land keeps getting expensive, construction costs keep getting expensive, we're always going to see something higher and better than what we traditionally would see in the Central Valley, right? I mean, some of those users need 1 million square footers. We're not getting 1 million square footer in the Bay Area anytime soon. I think it's safe to say that. I know there's a customer looking for one in Fremont particularly, but there's not enough land, right? So, I mean, I just think making those approvals as easy as possible to allow for development is really going to lead to the next customer that everyone wants to see.
But Janet,
Just one more idea to that. I think, echoing on what Donovan said, I think you have and what Janet said, you have the economic cycle with the funding cycle and the tenant prospect cycle. And then you have the political cycle where you have electeds and planning commissioners constantly changing. And I think, I think a key takeaway is that, events like this, engagements with the brokerage community, engagements with the development community early and often outside of running up to a planning commission hearing is crucially important. Things like manufacturing day, things like building open houses on the brokerage side or development side, ribbon cutting, groundbreaking things, events and engagements where this industrial community, these industrial stakeholders have an opportunity to meet the political and residential stakeholders or resident stakeholders is crucially important. Because by the time you are at the planning commission, it's a little too late to start telling your story. And so it's on partly on folks like Donovan and us and the economic development, our peers in other cities, is to keep telling the story. But we often rely on narratives and reality checks of where the market is going from folks like Ed and John and Janet from the real estate broker side and the development side. So I think that is an area I think we can certainly improve. And I think that'll make your entitlement path a lot easier.
And I think the other part of that, Ed, if I can, is we're past peak last mile. And I think that there was a period of time there in 2020, 2021, every building went last mile. And I think for, reasonable,
Explain that a little bit, John. What last
well,
mile?
it was, one, we were in lockdown, and two, you had, one big user who was just on a massive expansion kick as they built out their platform. And so many buildings went for last mile, and they're releasing vans in fleets of 20 or 30, every 15 to 20 minutes. And it did have a traffic impact. But if you look back now over the last 3 years, we've seen almost no last mile transactions. And, it's a little bit of a last battle, right? You've got your Maginot Line and somebody just goes right around it. There will be some last mile deals that still happen, but we're not going back to the days of every building that goes up that has a warehouse zoning going last mile. And I think we need to get that message out as well, because it's still fresh in everybody's memory that it felt like we were dropping, last mile warehouses in everywhere. We're past that. And, while it could happen, it's not going to happen, every time. It's not going to happen, 20% of the time at this point. And so
Can we also just acknowledge too, like, peak Bay Area hypocrisy when we're all just like ordering stuff constantly on our phones, and then we're like, oh, we can't have the Amazon in our city. And it's like, I buy way too much stuff from Amazon. I
But
wish
where's
I
my
didn't,
stuff?
but the convenience factor. So I think we'd all recognize, like, we want these, really quick deliveries and want the convenience of e-commerce. I mean, we do have to support it, right? And I want to kind of go back to Janet's comments just about entitlement process and one thing to note for some of the other cities on this call, we made the decision long ago in Fremont to make industrial by right process. So if you come in and you're within our FAR guidelines and meet our objective standards, similar to a lot of the state housing laws that have popped up over recent years, your project is allowed by right. So it doesn't go to planning commission or council. It's not subject to CEQA. It's not appealable. And so that streamlined process creates a lot of certainty for market participants. And we've been really the beneficiaries of a tremendous amount of
Donovan, I want you to
investment.
repeat that. Donovan, I want you to repeat that. So I come in with a
Mhm.
manufacturing process, advanced food. I'm going to make granola, whatever the case. How long does it take to get approved versus the old CUP method?
I'd probably say Fremont's not a good place for you to do something like that. We don't actually have a single food manufacturer in the city, but I know there's a lot up the 80 corridor. But if you wanted to come and do build a spec industrial project, you would just submit it's called a discretionary design review, which is a ministerial staff level design review process that's done concurrently with a building permit. So we have seen developers kind of from pre-application to doing site grading in 9 months. So it is possible. But typically we would say budget about a year for that process, with approved construction drawing, shovel ready project. And again, just not having it doesn't mean that we're not going to scrutinize the project. And, we hear from industrial developers that we like landscaping more than any other city in California. So I guess we like pretty industrial buildings, but at least they have the certainty of knowing that their project isn't going to get jammed up by some random planning commissioner, right? In addition, we talked about the warehousing and the different like allowable uses, right, within industrial. And I want to point out too that we allow for almost any kind of industrial use that you can imagine, allowed by right within our 3 different industrial districts. And it's not that we love warehousing, right? But there's a recognition that in order to get these projects underwritten, a developer needs to have flexibility for the potential array of uses that can go into these buildings. And that includes, they want the same thing as us. that advanced manufacturing technology tenant is going to pay higher rent. They're probably going to have higher credit quality. They're going to put a lot more into TI improvements into the building and be stickier. So that same tenant that we want as a city is going to be the same kind of tenant that the developer wants. They don't want a commodity warehouse user, but they need to have that flexibility to know if there isn't demand, that they have that as sort of a back pocket option. And there's sort of an understanding when a developer does a project in Fremont, if we do our jobs, that means the city and the developer and the listing, brokerage team, if we do our jobs, this isn't going to be a warehouse project. Or if it is a warehouse, if I think about the last few deals that have happened that have been warehouse projects in Fremont, they've been RK Group, which does, just-in-time logistics for 3 of our largest manufacturing companies. It's been for Quanta Computer, which is a huge, AI hardware manufacturer. Supermicro, another big manufacturer. Tesla, of course, we've heard of them. So when I think about like the warehousing uses that we're still seeing in Fremont that are paying those huge rent premiums, it's because it's supporting the local manufacturing economy. And we don't want to be in the business of saying like, oh, what kind of warehousing are you? And is this for manufacturing or is this for e-commerce? And we just want to take all that guesswork and scrutiny out. That's not our business. And we know if we're promoting the city that we're going to get the investments that we want over the long term.
So two facts that you mentioned, and one is people have to realize 40% and growing to almost 50 of retail purchases are online. That means a warehouse. Second, a lot of advanced manufacturing is really assembling. That means the product is in somebody else's warehouse that comes to there. So you need the ecosystem. We're going to talk about power in a second, but first, Paul, I'm going to ask you this question. With arena affordable housing demands where cities are, and I think that's important that we do this, construct more housing, especially as we mentioned, middle-class work housing. How do you preserve, Fremont does what they do. How do you preserve industrial zones and still increase the housing?
Yeah, we've been incredibly fortunate in Hayward. I think it has to go back to some of the work myself and my predecessors done over the last 10 years is to really characterize and educate our decision makers about the value of industrial lands, right? We're in the heart of the Bay, we're in the hardcore East Bay. This is the last bastion of industrial pockets of land before you go further east to the Tri-Valley or even further down to Tracy, where you're seeing those 1 million square foot bombers still come up every once in a while. We've been really fortunate but in that process to educate our community, educate our city leadership, the value of industrial lands and how it actually contributes, not only from the residential perspective of creating jobs, adding this convenience, to being able to be closer to people who will ship you same day your products, but also the revenue side, right? Cities are very sensitive to revenue. You hear a lot of headlines with cities with structural budget deficits. And a lot of, and I kind of alluded to, a lot of our financial stability, at least in Hayward, is from this industrial population. These tenants, these developers who are taking older stock, putting up brand new shiny buildings that are increasing property value, the tenants that are coming in, even warehouse tenants, they still invest a significant amount of money in racking and ESFR sprinklers and all the newest technologies to be able to run mechanized distribution centers. And so all of this equates to revenue opportunities for revenue generation for the city, and also a range. I think Donovan kind of hit the point, but it's a range of job opportunities, right? It's not white collar, I think, I won't say Elon Musk, but I've heard him say, the laptop class. It's not that. These buildings and the flexibility they create in our communities like Hayward allow for people to have these entry-level jobs and start gaining the skills on the jobs to get better jobs and then put more food on their tables for their families. And I think that whole story is what protects, at least in Hayward's context, protects our industrial lands. We have these RENA numbers from the state. Every city has a housing element that they have to get certified. We've been really fortunate, and we haven't seen any erosion in the last 15 years in Hayward, at least, taking industrial land and rezoning it for res.
I never would have thought that I'd see the day where Fremont has higher commercial land values than Santa Clara. But that's really indicative of, the strength of our industrial market here and, what we're seeing in office. And it's nice for the longtime industrial folks, right? They're kind of having their moment, right? And And for me, Paul really touched upon it, but just to drive it home further. So we have one of the largest auto malls, in Northern California. We also have the 7th largest outdoor shopping center in the country with Pacific Commons. And the sales tax revenue that we get from our industrial lands dwarfs those. I mean, it's not even comparable almost. And
That's a message
the
we
pro-
should
the
repeat.
property tax from advanced manufacturing, but even from, warehousing types of uses can be really significant. Those improvements, we see tenants all the time putting more money into tenant improvements than the building itself costs to construct. And so, if we know from our standpoint, like those businesses aren't going anywhere. And I think the developer and the landlords know that too, right? Those are very sticky tenants.
I want to move the conversation now to power.
Sure.
So, Janet, so how has the market changed in the last 5 years? It's now power.
Yeah, it's all about power. So essentially, the more power your building can get or delivered by a certain time frame, the higher likelihood you have of leasing that property quicker and for higher rates. Unfortunately, power isn't as readily available as we would like it to be. And even though the best thing we can do is basically get in queue with the power provider in order to facilitate that process once a customer is interested. In the good old days, not even a couple of years ago, everyone wanted 4,000 amps and that was sufficient, right? All our buildings get built with 4,000 amps. That doesn't even touch the minimum that customers want to see today, particularly for these advanced manufacturing uses.
That minimum. What is the minimum?
So I've been asked for anything between 5 megawatts all the way to 30 megawatts for just manufacturing. That doesn't include data center uses, which go up over 50 megawatts to 100 megawatts. Unfortunately, if you submit an application today to ask for those, it's kind of a chicken and egg situation, right? Like the provider won't give you the 10 megawatts without having a customer in tow, which makes sense, right? Because I think sometimes customers inflate that number as well. So essentially, PG&E wants to know everything that is being plugged into the walls for the lamest terms possible. Like how many machines are you going to plug in? How much power are those pulling? So that they're not over providing power to that facility and managing that load appropriately. So as you can imagine, when someone's planning to move into a building that's either under construction or not in construction yet, getting those details is really difficult. So that's been our biggest issue is, can we get those details early enough to meet your timeline? Because any process with the utility provider is going to take at least 9 to 18 months. So what we're trying to do is get large load studies into the utility providers and paying premiums to get a head start on those applications and requests for power so that we can bridge the gap a lot quicker for our customers.
John, are we losing tenants in the inner bay because of lack of power?
I think sometimes, the ones that need to move fast. I mean, I spend half my day talking about power, either, telling users to go back and look at their assumptions and see what they can do to dial them back, or, begging, PG&E to respond, or, asking developers to really confirm, this is what it says on your flyer. Is this what you really have? Or is this what the pipes are? And we do, but it's balanced by the workforce. I think a lot of these folks that are building data center equipment and other things, as much as they perhaps would like to go find power in a less expensive market, the labor and the talent and the headquarters are typically here. And so it's a balance. But yeah, power is the biggest topic of.
Let's stay on power, and I'm going to ask anybody to contribute. So what's the future of public-private microgrids or cogeneration? I know one of the business parks in San Ramon now generates 70% of its own power. So do we see a future for public-private microgrids, or set up our own power districts and to get ahead of the curve? Anybody?
Well, we're seeing not necessarily public-private, but we are seeing, the private sector step up to fill a gap where, PG&E is unable to serve. And so a recent example of this in Fremont, we have two different manufacturing companies here. One's Bloom Energy, another is called Quanta Computer, and they make if you've used a large language model or like something on social media, that the server in the data center was probably made here in Fremont. And so, the power needs are really tremendous. And so Bloom actually installed recently a 18 megawatt microgrid for Quanta at one of their 11 sites here in Fremont. And that's just to supplement and, additional power that they're bringing on with PG&E. And so we've gotten really creative with how we approach PG&E. We've really made it a point to understand the structure of how they provide and deliver power. We've made it a point to understand our infrastructure. We have 8 substations and 1 transmission substation in Fremont, and knowing what capacity is there and what opportunities there are for upgrades, and really trying to make sure that PG&E is aware. They used to actually look at long-range planning, documents of cities and use that for their forecasting. They don't have that anymore. And so we're making sure that anything we're aware of in our pipeline, PG&E is aware of, and they're taking that into an account. And we've had success actually getting them to upgrade transformers at some of their substations to basically accommodate our known demand that they didn't have in their forecast. And so it's a never ending thing. I never thought I would have spent so much time and energy, dealing with PG&E, but it's how we can add value for our industrial users.
Anybody else on this
Yeah,
subject?
I can add to that, and also just as a segue into one of the questions on the chat. So in terms of being able to, create enough power on our warehouses today for users, our buildings are equipped with solar panel ready roofs, and some projects are going in 50% solar panel day 1, some are going 100% solar panel day 1. For our traditional warehouse uses that don't necessarily pull a lot of power, we can create enough solar energy to offset that. However, when you start to get into the 10, 20, 30 megawatts, that's going to be nearly impossible. And then we're also dealing with constraints of land, right? Once you start to think about where to place some of that equipment, then you start to lose buildable square footage and you start to lose parking, and parking is equally as important for employees to come into the facility. So it's difficult because we do have land constraints to really think about how do we create that microgrid within, constrained land holdings. And then as it relates to kind of solar battery EV charging infrastructures for that question, and project timelines and California entitlement processes, I mean, we probably have the most sustainable building in the Bay Area right now. It achieved LEED gold and LEED platinum, and checked many of the boxes in terms of solar EV charging and enough recycling to reduce our carbon emissions. It's a beautiful building. Everyone knows who it is and what it is. It's in San Leandro, but that doesn't necessarily help our entitlements process, right? Because we still have to go through CEQA. CEQA still studies the impacts of the future operation, and that those potential operations are a variety of things, right? It could be warehouse, it could be manufacturing. So they have to take several things into account. So just because we're being sustainable friendly, it doesn't necessarily lead to an expedited review process, and it doesn't necessarily help our marketing process either, right? Our building looks amazing and it's sitting vacant, unfortunately.
And the other part of the education process is there are mandates for electric fleets coming down the road. We can barely get enough power to manufacture. If those were to be hard implemented, I don't know where the power comes from. The mandates have to match up with what's really possible with PG&E. And I just feel from where I sit, removed from Sacramento, that communication isn't going on. And it's going to be, as each year ticks off, it's going to be more difficult. I know building owners are planning for it with new development. They're plumbing conduit under their parking lot so they don't have to go back and rip them up. But if you've got to go in and plug all those in, we don't have the power for that. So it's an interesting, little bit out in the future, but certainly part of the education process. I think when we see the next mandate come down the pipes, we really need to ask the question, well, how are we going to power these things? We can't get enough power to turn on the lights in some of these buildings.
I think that's a subject that EDA should actually have a separate meeting on, Stephen, and for the constituency. But going back to Janet, how do you see, can you explain what State Proposition 98 does, and how does that impact your business model?
Yeah, as far as the positive about AB 98, there's not a ton of it, but the positive is that it improves the value of existing industrial projects, right? So if you have an existing portfolio in an industrial property, your value automatically went up with AB 98. However, that hurts the ability to build or redevelop even, new properties. The one thing, we're always going to have the CEQA challenges for infill Bay Area redevelopment, with the exception of Fremont, just there's no CEQA issues there. But even for redevelop, right? Like sometimes we look at our existing portfolio where our buildings are 30 to 40 years old, and we want to think about demolishing them to build Class A products. We're going to be less hesitant to do that, and that isn't good for the community. Like, why wouldn't we tear down a 30-40-year-old building to go build a Class A industrial building? AB 98 has us double thinking about that strategy. We were already looking at several opportunities to repeat, what we did in San Leandro, which is redeveloping older product into Class A because of the AB 98 constraints. It puts a limit on where the dock doors face because of the constraints of AB 98, and it also puts a limit on the size of the building. And then it's too vague right now to really understand the impacts long term, and I don't think it's the last time we see that version of the bill. So I'd be more concerned about what the revisions look like, because right now it looks like it was definitely something that was pushed to happen quickly, without much thought or specificity as to the impacts of future industrial.
That sounds like a normal law.
Yeah, that sounds like business as usual in California. So another bill that benefits incumbents and
How does 98
keeps competition
prevent
out.
rebuilding a building? Since it's not it's an existing industrial building. Why don't you explain that, Janet?
So if it's within a distance of a sensitive receptor, and because it's the infill Bay Area, we have a ton of projects that are within close proximity of a sensitive receptor.
Even if it's already industrial, I can't rebuild it.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, I don't know if half the world knows that.
Yeah. I do think it speaks to the need to protect your industrial districts where there's good cohesion, and protect them at all cost, and make sure that you don't have kind of gaps in your zoning that allow for incompatible uses to slip in, because as soon as you get one in there, you get like a Stratford school or something, it becomes this like slippery slope that you can't really get out of. And so I think part of it is from like a procedural regulatory standpoint through zoning, and then the other piece of it is from a political standpoint, again, of just constantly making sure that your stakeholders know the importance of your industrial lands and really become advocates for protecting them.
And sorry, Ed, just to clarify, it's not that you can't rebuild it, but you're rebuilding it with additional measures, and so that in itself is problematic. So sorry, I had to think about that a bit.
But you can't automatically do it. I mean, if the geometry of your parcel, has dock doors inside 300 feet or whatever it may be, you're kind of stuck with it, depending on what the egress. And you're exactly right, Janet. You end up with a commodity warehouse, with maybe heavy trucking activity and not a lot of economic upside. But it's still the same truck traffic. It's just with less economic upside and maybe jobs that aren't as good. Unintended consequences.
John, how is the current interest rate, construction cost increasing? How is that preventing new buildings from being built?
Janet, you'll be on top of this. When was the last time we saw somebody break ground? There's a project going on in Livermore, but it was 60-70% pre-leased, so that's broken ground. there's very little new groundbreaking, right? But, these projects have 12 to 24 month lead times to get them approved. The land is already owned, folks go forward. I think in the second quarter, we're going to finish the last delivery on the 880 corridor of this wave of new construction, and we'll be waiting for people to break ground at that point. So basically, it along with the slowdown in leasing has brought new construction to a standstill. There's uncertainty about exit cap rates. It's much more expensive. Land prices needed to readjust because they ran away when interest rates were low. So there's just been really nothing. We need to start a new cycle.
Yeah,
Man, say
I would,
something.
I would agree with that. Everyone's finishing the buildings they started construction on in 2023, 2024. We're gonna have to see that vacancy fill up before we start to see people put more shovels in the ground. Again, there's exclusion to that rule in some particular cities that are doing better from an vacancy standpoint. But generally, we have seen all our competitors, quote unquote, pencils down, shovels down from a spec construction standpoint. I think we're gonna start to see some of that change towards the end of the year, particularly if the current vacancy starts to lease up. But we're still watching interest rates, we're still watching rent growth, and there's not a ton of rent growth right now like there was in the past, and interest rates, kind of everyone believes they're going to stay where they are today. However, again, I do think that's going to change towards later of the year, at least for Prologis it is, because there's going to be this gap in demand if the current vacancy gets leased up and there's nothing coming down the pipeline. But otherwise agree with what John is saying.
And just as construction prices stabilized and maybe backed off a little bit, now you've got uncertainty around tariffs with steel and HVAC equipment and other things that is causing folks that thought, okay, maybe I'm going to start taking baby steps forward. I think we have to wait and see how that shakes out.
One question for Paul, then we'll have some closing comments. Do you see crime as or public safety issues in the industrial zones? Is that any kind of a concern, or is that?
Every once in a while, we'll hear some concerns from our industrial users. Hayward's older industrial, so a lot of our industrial real estate falls on or backs up to a Union Pacific Railroad track, which is outside the city's jurisdiction. So that's where it gets a little complicated, where you have encampments that are essentially on privately owned land. And so the city, aggressively works with our partners, even some that back up to Caltrans own, land at freeway entrances and things like that. So it is an issue every once in a while. And yeah, I mean, I haven't seen any particular business, saying they're going to leave or not renew their lease given these issues, but it is certainly, industrial real estate isn't immune to these social issues.
Yeah. So we have only 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask 4 of you, 1 minute apiece, not 2. Any closing comment to educate our audience, or you want to take away that you want to talk about? So I'll start with you, Janet.
One, appreciate the time to be here and kind of connect with, again, Donovan, John, Paul. I think this was a great panel to kind of get a sense of what's going on around the East Bay 880 corridor as it relates to industrial. My biggest takeaway is we want to continue to see cities be accepting of industrial product type, whether that means you might get a warehouse, but hey, it could also turn into a manufacturing building, given the trend that we're seeing today, and the growth that the Bay Area continues to see. We probably will see a higher, better use. But as a developer, we don't get to select who the tenant is. The tenant gets to select where they want to be based on incentives, labor, and proximity to that labor. But otherwise, great panel, and I appreciate being a part of it.
Donovan.
I think we covered a lot of ground here today. I just want to say thank you to Stephen and the team at East Bay EDA for just all of their leadership and promotion of our industrial sector. There's just tons of things they've been doing here since the pandemic and before. And I think it's incredibly important that this is an area where the East Bay really shines. And we were talking before the call about kind of playing to your strengths, and we are an industrial powerhouse statewide and nationally. And I hope that the folks on this call can continue to champion our industrial sector.
Good. Paul.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Kudos to Stephen and everyone on the panel for kind of working to tell the story of industrial. We have to tell it early and often. We have to continue to hold events like this, continue to interact with our residents who are the voters and the developers and the real estate brokerage community to make sure everyone remembers that, yeah, East Bay is an industrial powerhouse. We were, we will be. It is transformative, and modern industrial needs to be flexible in its design, so we can attract those new uses that the world's never seen. And so it's a matter of just protecting it and celebrating it in forums like this. Work and advocacy the East Bay EDA is doing with MTC, with their part of production areas and Resilient East Bay and East Bay Forward initiatives. It's a matter of constantly engaging and telling the story, so that big giant bad building with 50 dock doors it doesn't scare people off when it goes to a public hearing.
John.
I echo what everyone said here about the leadership of the EDA, and thank you for including me on the panel. I want to just quickly amplify an answer that Paul gave, and there are a couple of questions and comments in the chat about public safety. In certain cities and certain communities, public safety is a massive issue. And there are limited resources for policing, and I think a lot of times those are thrown to the residential and downtown areas, rightfully so. But without calling anybody out, I can tell you we are moving major corporations that are great employers out of communities and into other places because they're just not feeling safe, whether that means going to get a cup of coffee or a sandwich at lunchtime or in their parking lots. And it's something that has to be a focus, or we will lose people to the north and the east, and it'll start to carve out our industrial core.
Public safety in New York, they hijack trucks, and in LA, they actually stop trains and rob the trains with the stuff. So that is a concern.
I don't know, that makes us relatively more safe. But.
So one of our closing comments is I think EDA should sponsor a panel, a discussion on power and where do we get it, because that's where the future is. So again, I want to thank everybody on this panel for insightful comments. The other last comment is EDA has a regional mission. So every city should think of itself, if the big tenant lands in Fremont or in Livermore or in Hayward, the rest of the community benefits, because there's usually an ecosystem of 4 or 3 to 1 multiplier to supply any given facility. Stephen now is going to have some closing.
Well, I just want to, again, this has been a fantastic and really great and insightful conversation. And thanks to all of you for lending your respective perspectives and wisdom to this effort. Appreciate, of course, the support to East Bay EDA, but as we know, this is really about helping to create and ensure that we can maintain a thriving and prosperous region. So appreciate the work that all of you do on that. Thanks all of you for joining us today online. There will be a recording of this webinar that will be coming out soon and posted on our YouTube channel. And stay tuned for future events, both online and in person. Next week is our big East Bay Innovation Awards, but many other things as well coming up. Check out our website for more information. Thanks again for everybody. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.